Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm Leslie Octon, one of the Wisdom Ways team staff, and I'm so honored and happy to be able to introduce Ansay Dr. Tamara Gray. It's hard for me not to call her Ansay, and Ansay means teacher. Um, in Syria, they use the word Ansay for teacher, so she is my teacher, my mentor, my spiritual guide, director, all any name you want to use. I use Ansay. So I'm very, very pleased she's here with us tonight. Dr. Tamara Gray is a founder of Rabata, an organization dedicated to promoting positive cultural change through creative educational experiences. She holds a doctorate in leadership from the University of St. Thomas, a master's degree in curriculum theory and instruction from Temple University, and spent 20 years studying traditional and classical Islamic sciences, Quran, and Arabic in Damascus, Syria. Dr. Gray worked in the field of education for 25 years before moving into the nonprofit world. She is now both the executive director of Rabata and its chief spirituality officer. Her work includes the daily nitty-gritty of project design, as well as the support and mentorship of hundreds of women around the world. She is the instructor for more than 10 subjects at Rabata, teaches Rabatines, and contributes to curriculum development. Dr. Gray is also an author and translator. Her publications range from several culturally appropriate English language curriculum programs to translations of sacred text. She has authored 2 books, Joy Jot's Exercises for a Happy Heart and Project Lena, Bringing Our Whole Selves to Islam, and co-translated a compendium of the collection of sources on Sirah an-Nabawiyya. In addition to her work at Rabata, Dr. Gray is also on the Collegeville Institute's Interreligious Fellows Program, working to develop educational programming for faith leaders around social justice issues. She also serves as both faculty and an academic council member for the Islamic Seminary of America, teaches at the United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities, and is a senior fellow at the Yaqeen Institute. She has recently joined the Fiqh Council of North America in addition to her other responsibilities. Dr. Tamara is a mother of 3, grandmother of 2, an avid reader, and a lover of cultures, people, coffee, and food. And that's why we get along so well, for many other reasons. And so we're very happy to have Ansay is going to talk. And as she's talking, if you have any questions, go ahead and pop them into the chat. And we'll try to, she'll either see those questions and answer or say, I'll get to it a little bit later, or definitely leave time at the end to go through those questions. So welcome, Ansay.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. Only thing that could make it better is if we were all together in one big room. But I have a feeling quite a few of you might not be able to make it if that were the case. So I'll just be really happy that we get to be together here in this digital space. So today it's my job to, in a short time, try to present this idea of Islam and women, women and Islam, Muslim women. And so I've put together a little presentation. And as Leslie said, I will be sort of keeping my eye on the chat box as much as possible. If I use Arabic terms without translating them, you can call me out and say, what was that word you just used? But I will try not to do that. And I will try to be super clear. Yeah, so if you have questions in the midst, just throw them in the chat. And if I know I'm already going to reach that later, I will not answer it. I'll just wait until I get there. All right, so here is my presentation. So this is a picture of me. As you can see, you know me, and some lovely women. We were in Malaysia, actually, when we took this picture. And since my talk is called Women in Islam, I thought you should see some Muslim women. You know me. The woman in purple is both a professor in the medical school, as well as a philanthropist in Malaysia and Cambodia. She's opened a clinic in Cambodia and a school in Malaysia. The one next to her is a cardiologist, and she opened a chapter of my nonprofit there in Malaysia. Next to her, sort of in the back, is Sarah Abe, who has an incredible history with our organization here in Minnesota. She comes from Michigan, and was instrumental in us getting started here in Minnesota. But she came with us to Malaysia. So she lives here, not in Malaysia. Just that's it. And then the other person next to her is PhD and MD in medicine, the lady in the white scarf with the flowers around her neck. She's from the UK. She also came to Malaysia with us, also a medical doctor. And next to her, you can barely see her, is someone from Michigan, actually, one of our board members, who is the head of a $5 million nonprofit in Flint, Michigan. So I just thought it was important to share all of these women, because very often Muslim women get this sort of rap that we are, I don't know, not accomplished. And I want you to know that Muslim women are all different kinds of women, just like every other woman. And I also am going to try a little trick here where I click on the link to say that we're going to use hello to help you remember what we're talking about today. Okay, so hello is our acronym. We're going to cover 5 ideas around women in Islam. Hallowed tradition. So what is our sacred tradition around Muslim women? We're going to get into a little bit of theology there. Empowering systems. What are some of the financial and legal systems that we have? Some lived literacies, some legal discussion, and we're going to talk about overcome some of the obstacles that we do face uniquely as Muslim women, and what different women are doing to overcome those obstacles. That is a huge hope to cover all of this. So I do want to say, while I will do my darndest to cover it all, none of it will be covered in depth, and everything we cover could be talked about for a very long time on its own. So think of this as your ice cream shop where you're getting a little tiny spoonful of all of the flavors, and one day later we can have a double scoop of any one flavor. Okay, that's how we're going to think about it. So first of all, just to talk a little bit about hallowed tradition, I've got a little picture there of a scaffolding because I'm trying to build for you a scaffold. So for Muslim women, the sacred tradition is based on 2 sacred texts. One is the Quran, I'm sure you've heard of it, and the other is what we call the Sunnah, or we call it the Hadith. That's the words and actions of the Prophet of Islam. So I have a verse here in Arabic. فاستجاب لهم ربهم أني لا أضيع عمل عامل منكم من ذكر أو أنثى بعضكم من بعض. I apologize for the Arabic, but I'm sharing with you in Arabic for a reason. For Muslim women, only the Arabic Quran is the Quran. Any translation is an interpretation, and it's helpful, but it's not considered the Quran on its own. This particular verse says, and their Lord responded to them, naught is the work of any of you lost, be he male or be the one male, be you male or female, you are one of another. So this verse, and then the verse on the next page, which is also in Arabic, but you can look at it because it's pretty, is another verse that speaks to the theological concept of men and women in Islam, or women, if you will, since that's our topic today. This verse is a long one. I won't read the whole thing in Arabic, but it is the Muslim men and the Muslim women, the believing men and the believing women, the worshipful men, the worshipful women, the truthful men, the truthful women, the patient men, the patient women, etc. God has for them forgiveness and great reward. These 2 verses, along with others, lay the theological foundation of the concept of are women and men on equal footing in Islamic theology? And the answer is yes. Men and women are on equal theological footing in Islamic theology. That's not the same as every Islamic society, but it is theologically that men and women both stand before God with their deeds and their worship as independent individual people, I was recently in a talk with a professor from Cambridge. The talk was in Cambridge, but it was in Chicago, but it was Zoom. One thing he said that I thought was important, so I'll mention it here, is that a lot of times people try to say that men and women complement each other. And that's not really an Islamic thought. Islamic thought is that men and women are both independent individuals. They don't complement one another as though one has less and another has less of something, and they need those things. But rather, men and women are independent individuals theologically in this faith. Okay, so that moves us into this historical. So I'm still in this idea of a sacred tradition. What's our tradition? What do we look at? I'm going to fly through 15 slides now, so forgive me for that. But just, it's not meant to be a history lesson. Just remember the little tastes of ice cream, okay? This is actually not even a whole spoon, because I really think that when we're talking about a sacred tradition, it's always important to look back and see who are the mentors, who are the people that we're looking up to. I've skipped the first generation, the earliest generation, which is the generation of Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. So what I've done is skip that generation and go to other generations just to introduce you to some women. Now, those years are the Hijri years, so those are the centuries after the death of the Prophet of Islam. And we are now in the 15th century, so I'm basically going to show you 14 pictures. This one is a woman named Amra bint Abdurrahman. She was a jurist, and her opinions were very important and taken above some of the male important jurists of the time. Nafisa al-Tahira was a woman who, even to today, her scholarship and piety was so well known that people still visit her grave today to remember her. And she was a teacher of some of our most important early scholars. I don't know if you've ever heard of al-Qarawiyyin, or Qarawiyun, maybe it's called in English. The university in Morocco that is the oldest still living university. It was built and started by Fatima al-Fihri, who is represented here. Maryam al-Jalliya al-Istirlabiyya, you can see she's holding an astrolabe in her hand. This is 4th century. She was a very important engineer and scientist who worked in astrolabes, making them more and more precise, and she was hired and paid for her work by the governor of that time. Karima bint Ahmed al-Marwaziya is I like her because of her, she was very famously very strict, what we might call a very strict professor, where if anybody wanted to get her ijaza, so that word ijaza, a man named George Maqdisi, I don't know if you're interested in further studies on your own, but a man named George Maqdisi out of the University of Pennsylvania wrote a book in the 80s called The Rise of Colleges. And that book traces the development of the bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees to the ijaza system amongst Muslims. So it's an interesting book to read if you're interested in that kind of stuff. But her ijaza, or degree, was very difficult to get. She was like the Harvard degree of hadith studies, hadith being the words of the Prophet ﷺ. Fatima bin Sa'd al-Khair is another person who traveled a lot for knowledge. She traveled from where she was born in China, all across Cairo, Damascus, and different places to learn different topics. Razia Sultan was a political leader. She became the political leader because her father decided that she had more piety and wisdom than her brothers. And so she was the inherited political leader, the second leader of the Delhi Sultanate, which is over in the Indian subcontinent today. Al-Adar al-Karima was in Yemen, and she was queen or leader of Yemen for 14 months and famous for the peace that she brought, but also the philanthropic work that she did. Bibi Raji back in India was sort of like almost a very rich philanthropist today, who was very interested in social change, and she would fund scholars and projects in order to create that social change that was important to her. So she was like a foundation in and of herself. Queen Aminatu was a fascinating woman. There's actually a movie made out of her life now. I haven't seen it, And I don't know that the history of it is what I read of her life. But nonetheless, she was a very important military leader, known to be a fierce warrior. And she was one who developed clay fortress walls, which is very cool as well. Mumtaz Mahal, Taj Mahal. I'm sure you've heard of the Taj Mahal. This was a building that built because of this woman here. She was very, very religious woman. It said that she taught her husband about the night prayers. She had 14 children and died in giving birth to the 14th, and her husband was in so much grief he built the Taj Mahal in her memory. But she was also a very, very important woman in her line of spirituality, and her daughter actually, which I don't have a poster of her, but her daughter actually became the ipso facto leader because their father was just building the Taj Mahal. Esma Ibrit was a calligraphist and artist, and her work is still found in Turkey. And Nana Isma'u, someone very close to my heart, I could do a whole 2 hours just on her, was a scholar, poet, and activist in West Africa, and developed a whole new pedagogical method, really, along with the curriculum program in order to educate women and children out in the villages and the lands that the covered, which is pretty much Nigeria of today. Amina Asilmi is an interesting person. She lived in the United States. She was born in 1977, and she was one of the people working with the National Organization of Women who worked to establish rape as a war crime. Believe it or not, before her work, it was not a war crime, and that was because of the Bosnian War at the time, where rape was one of the weapons of the Serbs, and she was one of the people to make sure that it became a war crime. And I will say also, in spirit of Islamophobia, after she had worked so hard to make this happen, when they got the award for it, they asked her not, the National Organization of Women asked her not to come on stage because of the way she dressed, which is, I mean, it's just horrifying. She was a fighter, and she argued with them up and down and pointed out to them the great bigotry that they were saying, until they agreed, and she was able to stand on the stage with them. She also is the instigator of the Forever stamp, the Eid stamp. Okay, I think that's the end of my history. Yeah, so that's just an introduction to a whole bunch of women.